that work? Teacher one. So thanks everyone for coming out. I know it's really a tough time of year to make it out to lectures and so on after the additional burden of coming out after starting in the studio and cold. So much appreciated. I've got a great pleasure to introduce Ana Maria Leon today, who is joining us from Michigan. She's based out of Ann Arbor, where she has a joint appointment in humanities and architecture in University of Michigan. She's both an architect and an architectural historian. Her research focuses on the intersections of modernity, pedagogy, and politics in art and architecture, especially looking at the networks that exist between the Americas and Europe. She's currently at work on a book, that examines housing projects by the Catalan architect Antonio Gramsci in Buenos Aires, looking at the way in which these projects act as kind of mediators between a certain avant-garde fascination with the unconscious and state's mandate to also control crowds. So a very interesting kind of bit of historical research. I won't go through her entire trajectories, but to sort of state that she's worked at the intersections of pedagogy and politics in Latin American art and architecture. She's looking at the translation of ideas across distant sites and spaces. And her other sort of more recent work that we've talked a little bit about today, and then maybe we can speak more about toward the end, is looking at public space as a ground where states and their constituents come into contact. I find, so we had a very nice discussion just earlier today that many of you were there for. And I find really interesting how Ana Maria, her work is sort of looking at the kind of boundaries that begin to make distinct forms of knowledge that sort of divide up epistemologies and institutions and spaces of exhibition as really the sites of kind of both contestation, but also sites of inquiry that I find her work really relevant in sort of exposing like the sort of innocent appearing ways in which knowledge is sort of formed, presented, taught, and so on, as really the things themselves that need to be the frameworks, let's say, that need to be somehow historically interrogated and perhaps deconstructed to an extent. So with that, I'd just like to welcome Ana Maria. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much. And thank you for coming on a Friday evening. I am going to read, and I'm going to be under 40 minutes. I'm an animated reader. So I take it as a challenge that this is on a Friday. So we're in Brazil, 1959. In Sao Paulo, architect Oscar Niemeyer has recently completed the park of Ibirapuera, which we see here. A large pavilion, this guy here, hosts the Sao Paulo Biennial, and a covered walkway known as the marquee connects it to other sites within the park. And it's under this marquee that the Italian architect Lina Bo Bardi and Brazilian playwright Martim Gonçalves installed Bahia no Ibirapuera, which means Bahia in Ibirapuera the park. So if this biennial in Sao Paulo confirmed the nationalist narrative of Brazil as future, with a sophisticated selection of abstract works housed in a building designed by the architect of the state, Niemeyer, this small exhibition countered this narrative with a call for the vernacular or folkloric objects of the northeastern state of Bahia as markers of active popular agency. This installation of popular art was a particular provocation, situated as it was in the middle of the site and in the middle of an event meant to consecrate Brazil as a leader in high modernism. And furthermore, it was a complete contradiction to the prior trajectory of its architect. So today, what I'm going to present are two contradictory visions of the didactic power of exhibitions through two exhibitions by Lina Bo Bardi. designed and partially curated by her. She's an architect who has received much recent attention through exhibitions and publications. And my research nuances the hagiographic, very laudatory tone of these narratives by looking at Bo Bardi's trajectory against the grain, as it were. And rather than take down an architect who's finally receiving much needed attention, my aim is to complicate her narrative and reveal her practice and the practice of architecture at large as a series of political choices. So why exhibitions? Sociologist Tony Bennett has theorized the long history of exhibitions as ideological agents of power and capital, summing up this agency as the exhibitionary complex. Bennett expands on Antonio Gramsci's points on how the modern state seeks to educate its citizens, and on Michel Foucault's insights on the prison and the school, by looking at the museum and at international exhibitions as spaces in which the public is instructed on how to look and what to look at, and by virtue of this knowledge comes to see itself, the public comes to see itself in the place of power, constituting a self-regulating citizenry. Via Bennett, we understand exhibitions as producing two interrelated identities, that of the power represented by the exhibition, that is, the nation state, or capital, and that of a willing, complicit, and compliant audience. What Bennett fails to note is that this display of power and capital has on occasion been resisted by using the same exhibitionary tactics in order to offer a counter-narrative to the state. Thus, while in the first example I will present, here on your left, we will see Bo Bardi acting as an agent of capital and of a developmentalist state. In the second one, we will see her operating in resistance to these interests. In her counter-exhibition, Bo Bardi and her co-curator, Bernard Gonçalves, called attention to the hegemonic state narratives by introducing forgotten populations into sites of privilege and power. And in doing so, they revealed the workings of the exhibitionary complex, transforming the space of exhibition into a space of dissensus and contestation. My broader argument today is that rather than a singular trajectory, Bo Bardi's contradictory choices point to the struggle of the architect to make the right political choices, particularly under the struggle of authoritarian governments. So the first stumbling block in Bo Bardi's biography comes through the links of her husband, Pietro Maria Bardi, to the Mussolini regime. Back in 1931, Bardi, her future husband, had hosted an exhibition on rationalist architecture in his gallery in Rome and written a book titled Polemic, Report on Architecture for Mussolini, in which he aimed to convince the fascist dictator of the advantages of rationalism as the language of fascist architecture. Here, Bardi tried to turn Mussolini's words on the need to, quote, create a new art, an art of our times, a fascist art, unquote, into a manifesto for modernity for architecture. He ignored the context of Mussolini's speech, which had outlined an art that should be, quote, traditional and at the same time modern, unquote. And instead, Bardi strived to link classicist architecture to the taste of the old, the past, and mediocrity, and align fascism with the young, the avant-garde, and the future, a modern and rationalist architecture. After the exhibition, Bardi turned into an important voice on architectural debates in Rome through the publication of his journal Quadrante, which had the outspoken aim of defending both rationalist architecture and fascism. Interspersed with fragments of Mussolini's speeches, political commentary, and essays on modern art and architecture, glossy pages presented photographs promoting fascism, including Mussolini, mothers hugging their soldier sons, Italian landscapes, and modern architecture. The journal directors, Bardi and his partner Bontempelli, self-consciously displayed themselves along with their subjects. And here we see Bardi featuring himself aboard the Patrice II, talking to Le Corbusier. And here, in a rather inconvenient image, they feature the front page of an Argentinian newspaper, and what it's saying in Spanish is that Bontempelli had a very unsuccessful trip to Argentina, trying to transmit Mussolini's message, and there was a series of protests during his lecture, and the audience turned off the light. In the meantime, Lina Bo was a young architect, whose thesis project had been a maternity for unwed mothers, and in 1939, fascist Italy, so she was a very liberal young woman. She was this liberal woman working in a male-dominated profession in a country ruled by the most conservative of governments. But there's some confusion surrounding her politics during the war. Later, when she was well established and in Brazil, she would remember her youth in Italy, claiming she had joined the resistance and the clandestine Communist Party, and had been persecuted by the Gestapo for an article written in Domus magazine during her tenure as an editor, which was between 1944 and 1945. And this is Bo Bardi reminiscing years later. 1944. Now the Nazi fascists were underground, the traitors of life and humanity. Far better to defy fate and death on the terrace of some building, watching the fireworks show of searchlights and the airplane's machine guns. One article I wrote, a criticism of urbanistic architecture, in an editorial of the Domus magazine, deserved the attention of the Gestapo. I escaped by a miracle, underground. It is curious if we look at this text that in her recollection, Bo has a double meaning for the word underground, so you can find it at the beginning and at the end of the text. It is both the dark place where the Nazi fascists hide, and also the place where she must go to take refuge from the Gestapo. So in any case, an examination of the 1944-1945 issues of Domus reveals no such article by Bo. The journal did have a general interest in post-war rebuilding, often pointing out delays in reconstruction and housing shortage problems. But during her time at the journal, Bo only wrote 2 articles, one on interior design and the other on fabrics in the art palace. At some point, towards the end of the war, Bardi and Bo met, and in 1946, they left Italy behind. This is a post-war Italy in which Bardi, who had been very outspoken as a fascist, could no longer get work. So they left Italy for the promise of Brazil. When Bo and Bardi arrived in Brazil, they stepped into a country transitioning between conflicting military governments. Getulio Vargas had initially modeled his Brazilian state after Mussolini's fascist Italy, and then switched loyalties to the Allies in 1942, only to be deposed by Gaspar Dutra, who led a military contingent distrustful of his acceptance of United States influence and loans. 1 month after landing in Rio, Bardi organized an exhibition of antique Italian painting to sell the contents of his collection brought from Italy expressly for this purpose. So he packed his whole art collection in this ship and took it and sold it in Brazil as a way to sort of establish himself. Either there or by other accounts even before leaving Italy, the couple met Brazilian businessman Assis Chateaubriand, nicknamed Chateau, owner of a media empire that included 34 newspapers, 36 radio stations, and 18 television stations in Brazil. It is this association with Chateau which proved to be the lifeline that allowed the couple to pass from the old world into the new. So Chateau took the couple to Sao Paulo and showed them the first site for the art museum he had become obsessed with building. And he insisted Bardi take Bo on the trip. He said, "You will do well to take your wife with you because as she is an architect, she will be responsible for the renovation project." Bardi and Bo, his art curator and architect, were the perfect team for Chateau, as he provided the art expertise and she worked on the architectural projects, often before they were approved by local authorities. The first location of the Sao Paulo Museum of Art, or MASP, was inaugurated in 1947, 1 year after Bo and Bardi's arrival. The museum was set up in Chateau's Associated Newspapers building with the explicit aim to bring art to the masses, or more precisely, to bring European art to the Brazilian masses. It was set up as this didactic exhibition of the history of art, and Bo's description of the exhibition display is very illustrative of what her aims were. She describes it as a deliberately elementary and didactic classification, quote, directed towards uninformed, unintellectual, unprepared masses, unquote, contrasting traditional museums in, quote, countries of old culture to the idea of a museum for a country deprived of the past. This would be Brazil. Both display panels recall the structure of Persico Nizzolis called Metal Room in Mussolini's famed Italian Aeronautical exhibition of 1934. And Bo explained her exhibition display was purely a didactic device, making art easily accessible to all. But it was clear that the aim of the exhibit, curated by Bardi and led by Chateau, was to bring culture to the Brazilian people by teaching them to appreciate European art. The political subtext here is important if we consider the country hovered between the extreme conservative nationalism of the Dutra government and the ambiguous populism of Getulio Vargas. Chateau, funding the whole enterprise, was part of a group of economists, media conglomerates, and import merchants trying to sway Dutra towards policies that would welcome foreign capital and allow the outside market to regulate prices. In this context, an exhibition of European art aligned perfectly with unstated political and economic interests. So Bardi and Bo established, after this first initiative, Bardi and Bo established themselves in the wealthy Sao Paulo suburb of Morumbi in a house designed by Lina, her glass house. And in 1950, the couple teamed up to publish Habitat, a journal sponsored by Chateau again, and ostensibly dealing with Brazilian art and architecture. The journal echoed Bardi's old campaigns in Quadrante, but this time it was mobilized towards the building of the mash pit. So essays on the importance of museums as social condensators, translations of Rockefeller's speeches of museums as citadels of civilization, and even an urgent appeal from Chateau, now or never, all found their way to the publication's pages. Between 1947 and 1943, Bardi and Chateau made numerous trips to Europe to select and buy the collection for this new museum, taking advantage of works made available by the post-war recession. The shopping excursions were financed through the money of Brazilian coffee exporters, pressured by Chateau into donating funds for the project. And Bardi remembers his friend's words. This is Chateau talking to Bardi. The works that are going to make our gallery are done in the southern hemisphere, Bardi. We have to march like two Huns through Europe, devastated by the war, buying paintings. The European nobility and bourgeoisie are broke, Bardi, broke. If we run, we're going to buy the best between the 13th and 17th centuries at the price of bananas. I like the clip. So while the museum was being built, these purchases were exhibited in Europe so that the First World could validate the young institution, dispelling doubts that the paintings might be fake. These doubts, raised by critics Mario Pedrosa and Silvio Mendes, also denounced Bardi's political past as a fascist. Paradoxically, while Bardi was dodging these attacks, Bo was becoming politically closer to his opponents. Construction for the permanent location of the mash pit started in 1959. Here it is in construction. By then, Bo had started traveling to Bahia in the northeast region of Brazil and turned away from her political influences and aesthetics. This turn was rendered political in Bahia in Ibirapuera, the exhibition she installed with playwright Martim Gonçalves in 1959, the same year the construction of the mash pit starts, in the middle of the Sao Paulo Biennial. So now I'll turn to this exhibition and its message. Here in the park of Ibirapuera, a segment of Niemeyer's covered marquee was enclosed by walls, and the interior was softened through the use of dark blue cotton curtains. These preliminary sketches, the curtain coils and turns, suggesting some specific modern influences that perhaps some of you might remember from history class. But the final design discarded these coils in favor of a more open space. A white curtain was hung as ceiling, covering the concrete slab and diffusing lighting into a soft glow. The floor was covered with a layer of eucalyptus leaves, which were renewed each day and filled the room with their fragrance. The effect was borrowed from popular festivals in Bahia. This is the final plan. So the curtain is sort of layered, circling the whole space. Upon entering here, the visitors went through a dark corridor illuminated by a series of slide projections, so they're going around here, with images and sounds of Afro-Brazilian music. The elongated hallway was divided by a row of display cases. These folks here. The larger space contained a series of objects installed as sculptures. these guys here. They were all extracted from the traditions of the Northeast. Here, a carranza, an elaborately carved and painted wooden bow. Further into the hallway, a rustic mannequin in the traditional leather dress of the Sertão, the desertic region of the state. Further behind, a windmill tree, such as one would find in street fairs. Over there, another one made of paper flowers. On the right-hand wall, just in front of the curtains here, a series of stands with rough concrete bases encrusted with seashells held a collection of photographs documenting the daily life and festivities of Bahia. And here I point out that the structure of these objects is actually not that different from the structure that she had designed before. It's rather the content that had provided a contrast. A gilded wall towards the end framed Catholic sculptures. The exhibition cases, these guys here, painted in bright colors, displayed everyday popular objects from the Northeast: hammocks, baskets, ceramics, toys, home utensils, and other handicrafts. Tapestries here, so these are the artifacts. Large tapestries were hung in the back of the cases, and they faced a display of orisha, these guys, spirits, representations of candomblé, the Brazilian religion based on the African beliefs. At the end of the hall, way here in the back, got lost. Oh, at the end of the hall, a brick wall painted white held a series of exvotos, small religious wooden sculptures used in sanctuaries in the northeastern desert, where they usually pile up until burned and thrown away. This wall enclosed a small room, this room here, used to present anthropology lectures or popular music presentations. Music played continuously, and throughout the biennial, the site hosted various dance and musical performances. Traditional Bahia street vendors, Afro-Brazilian women in typical dress, wandered around the visitors offering small plates from the region, completing the transformation of the space into a sensorial interpretation of the Brazilian Northeast. Images of the exhibition and its contents, as well as the manifesto, have been published in Lina Bo Bardi's monograph, and more recently they have been described in a doctoral dissertation and in a biography of the architect. Yet there are contradictions between the work's patronage and critical stance that bear further analysis. While the exhibition sought to rescue the traditions of the Northeast, it was funded by forces eager to promote its modernization. It was through Bo Bardi's connections with Matarazzo, main sponsor and organizer of the biennial, that the exhibition had happened in the first place. It was also sponsored by the Bahia University Theater School, where Gonçalves taught, the state of Bahia, and the newspaper conglomerate owned by Chateau, Bo Bardi's main patron. Bo Bardi's presence in Bahia, furthermore, was partially due to these connections, as she was meant to direct a project by Chateau for a museum of modern art in Bahia. She would later write and complain about the need to work within these networks. But I would like to delve into these contradictions with an analysis of the project surrounding this work. I suggest it was precisely the temporal nature of the exhibition and its contents that allowed our curators to lie their own connections with the network of capital in which they were enmeshed. I argue Bo Bardi and Gonçalves mobilized the ephemeral characteristics of this exhibition towards political aims through three interrelated strategies. Through its temporary location in a site representative of the modern state, Ibirapuera, through its contents and the region they represented, Bahia, and through the temporality of the theatrical event, a type of proto-performance art. And in doing so, they turned ephemerality into a political gesture of resistance against the state's developmentalist project and its hegemonic appropriation of culture and production. So site, region, and content. So I'll go to the site first. As I mentioned before, Bahia no Ibirapuera was located in the park of Ibirapuera, a Niemeyer-designed landscape just outside the Matarazzo Pavilion, which hosted the biennial and is one of several Niemeyer buildings in this park. By 1959, Niemeyer had consolidated his reputation as the architect of Brasilia, the country's new capital, and the campaign promise of President Juscelino Kubitschek. Thus, Niemeyer was the architect, the official architect of the new modern Brazil, the Brazil of the future. Kubitschek's developmentalist policies were meant to transport the country towards this future, and Brasilia was the perfect image to both represent and help rally the people of Brazil in this direction. The artworks that filled the biennial pavilion easily collaborated with this vision. Bo Bardi and Gonçalves wrote and distributed a manifesto in their exhibition where they dismissed these works, so these were the works exhibited in the biennial itself, in the official, very large building. They dismissed these works as what they called imbibed in metaphysics. And in a reprint of this text for the Italian magazine Domus, so now speaking to her Italian audience, Bo Bardi went further and added the names of these two Italian artists, Burri and Fontana, as examples of what she called neoclassic negation. So these were abstract artists working in a post-war Italian generation, exploring the wounds of the conflict. That this is what they argued through abstract means. But for her Italian readers, Bo Bardi described the work as indicative of art's desire for self-annihilation. And she contrasted these tortured work to her and Gonçalves' exhibition, in which material precariousness meant foregoing here I'm quoting her, foregoing the undesired eternity of the work of art, its reabsorption into this historical moment, its not wanting to resist time. The display of popular art and everyday objects was here an argument to the right of the non-privileged, to aesthetic expression and poetry. And to our curators, these objects showed a vital necessity for expression that's intrinsic to human life, blurring the boundaries of art and life. A truly avant-garde aspiration. And the complete opposite of Bo Bardi's prior claims to educate the uninformed masses of Brazil. If you remember, it's quite a contrast with her prior very European attitude to bring European art to the Brazilian uneducated masses without a past. Right? Thus, the exhibition pushed against the narrative of the Sao Paulo Biennial and of the Brazilian state at large by opposing this myth of an eternal modernity and the idea of artistic genius with the ephemeral qualities of everyday objects manufactured by the inhabitants of the northeastern state of Bahia. So now I turn to Bahia. As early as the mid-17th century, Portuguese settlers forcibly brought African slave workers to work in cacao, sugar, and tobacco plantations in Brazil, more than any other country. An estimated 4.9 million human beings were brought into Brazil, and most of them came in through the port of Salvador de Bahia. When slavery was abolished in 1888, the plantations kept up their profit margins through low wages, continuing a culture of exploitation and poverty. The regions remained isolated from the rest of Brazil until the 1950s, when oil was discovered. This shift to an oil-based economy created unemployment in the rural population, prompting them to migrate to the cities. Kubitschek, the president that built Brasilia, elected in 1956, was eager to promote the area's industrialization while minimizing social conflict. Hoping to palliate the population, local authorities supported several cultural initiatives as part of the modern package that was meant to fold the region into the new Brazil. So here's where Bo Bardi and Gonçalves' exhibition fit in. It was intended by its funders as a placating device. But this exhibition of popular, so-called primitive art was not a passive intervention. Rather, its curators meant to push against the region's accelerated development. It had to engage with the population and culture of Bahia as outsiders to the region. Neither Bo Bardi nor Gonçalves were from Bahia. She was Italian. Gonçalves was from the neighboring state of Pernambuco. They were funded by the network of capital they sought to resist. They were both educated in Europe, and they were both white, further distancing them from the racially challenged environment in which they were operating. How might they, in this context, let the subaltern speak? In the months before the event, Bo Bardi turned to a close reading of Marxist theoretician Antonio Gramsci, and Sonia Lima has noted how she frequently paraphrased him in her newspaper column, An Eye on Bahia. Gramsci's observation on folklore were key in Bo Bardi's approach to popular art. And here's Gramsci. One can say that until now, folklore has been studied primarily as a picturesque element. Folklore should be instead studied as a conception of the world and life, implicit to a large extent in determinate strata of society, and in opposition to official conceptions of the world. So rather than essentialize a certain group of folk as folk, Gramsci viewed folklore as a series of discursive practices that constitute a certain identity. It could easily be co-opted by cultural hegemony, through a nostalgic view that fossilized cultural production into the past. But it also had the potential to be a cultural force of resistance to it. Thus, we should distinguish between the conservative traces of cultural production and those creative, oppositional, and potentially progressive strains that pointed to a critical thought that was spontaneous to all humankind. A serious study of folklore, then, would result in the blurring of the boundary between folklore and modern culture in order to constitute a true art of the masses. Following Gramsci, the exhibition sought to distance the work of the people of Bahia and popular art at large from a picturesque, nostalgic representation of the past. Rather, it was active and present, a living set of practices that had the power to counter the narrative of the state. So let us now turn to the sensorial display and the conversations that surrounded it. The exhibition participated, and in some cases preceded the tactics of the Brazilian avant-garde through a hybrid presentation of display and performance. Here, Gonçalves' work as theater playwright was key. He curated the contents of the exhibition. He had collected these artifacts throughout his tenure as director of the theater school in Bahia. Performances of Afro-Brazilian songs, capoeira, a combination of martial arts and dance, and percussion instruments ran through the 3-month length of the event, performed by actors and students of his theater school. Bahia women, attired in traditional dress, offered quitutes, or small dishes, to the public, in recreation of familiar streets in the region. These proto-performances furthered the exhibition's brief against the immortal work of art through an emphasis on ephemeral, intensely sensorial experiences. The slide projections in the obligatory dark passage, the smell of the eucalyptus leaves strewn on the floor, the percussion drums, the bodies engaged in dance, the taste of food. Rather than being represented as a set of traditional or nostalgic practices, Bahia was in Ibirapuera, a living, dynamic, and present culture. These tactics were part of a larger discourse of participatory art taking place in Brazil. The accelerated modernization had prompted a debate among intellectuals and artists on the values of popular culture. And historians have noted how, in these discussions, Bahia's impoverished population was sometimes idealized as the protagonist of artistic activity and political protest. Yet it was Bahia and the Brazilian Northeast at large which would produce the Cinema Novo of Glauber Rocha, who assisted in the exhibition, and the Tropicalia movement of Gilberto Gil and Caetano Veloso. But these developments were still in early formation at the time of the exhibition. Another figure who might have contributed to the critical scaffolding of this work is Marxist pedagogue Paulo Freire, working at the time in the neighboring state of Pernambuco. Freire proposed that education had a liberating potential to be achieved through dismantling of the traditional hierarchical structures in favor of a dialogue among equals. Finally, only a few months before the exhibition, the Neo-Concrete Artists group published a manifesto arguing for a shift in art from the static object to the sensations produced by the object. The group was influenced by phenomenology of Maurice Merleau-Ponty and his focus on the senses. He was a widely read figure in Brazil at the time. But their work would not turn from object to event until 1965, when Helio Itísica led a group of samba dancers from the favelas into the Modern Art Museum in Rio, attired in his parangolés, works of art meant to be worn and performed with. The dancers were summarily expulsed from the museum, and their expulsion contrasts with Bo Bardi and Gonçalves' successful incorporation of marginal groups into this mainstream exhibition 6 years before. Thus, Bo Bardi and Gonçalves were part of and helped lead a politically charged cultural formation of participatory practice and popular empowerment that countered Kubitschek's accelerated modernization with a turn towards the disenfranchised as the producers of both art and revolution. Bahia no Ibirapuera, the exhibition, highlights an approach to ephemerality beyond the precarity of the objects it exhibited, into a different understanding of art as event, as a moment when theater and life may come together in a brief but intense sensorial experience, one that might elide, through its very tactics, the hegemonic reach of the developmentalist state. Seen here on the day of the inauguration, and reported in the ample coverage the exhibition got in the press, President Kubitschek is shown, quote, grabbing a cookie and clapping to the rhythm of the capoeira, unquote. This moment points to the efficacy of the exhibition and its combined tactics. Here is the personification of everything the exhibition opposed, literally consuming it, but completely oblivious to its critical stance. Bo Bardi continued to work in Bahia, and her turn to the popular practices of the region influenced the rest of her life and practice. Her work was interrupted by the Brazilian dictatorship, which ruled the country between 1964 and 1985. Her culminating work was finished just at the end of this period. Started in 1977 and finished in 1986, the Sesc Pompeia might be Bo Bardi's most memorable and enduring contribution to the city of Sao Paulo, a leisure center including theater spaces, sports areas, living rooms, restaurants, and workshop spaces. And yet at the same time, as she was finishing this project, Bo Bardi turned once more to Lima's marquee. In 1982, and I'm ending with this, during the last years of the Apertura, the period of the waning of the dictatorship, Bo Bardi was commissioned by the Biennial Group to design the Museum of Modern Art, or MAM, in the same space where her exhibition had been installed. We see here in her drawing, this is the museum now, we see here in her drawing for this permanent building a longing for the prior space and her unrealized desire to have the walls painted in undulating shades of blue. Blue like that curtain that she had drawn, the blue curtain of the exhibition. So the ephemeral installation was replaced by a permanent museum, which is full of the works of high art that the exhibition had argued against. Inverting, and these are the plans, and this is the space now. So inverting the logic of the story I have just presented, a Niemeyer building on the other side of the park. So this is the Biennial Pavilion, this is where that exhibition was. The Niemeyer building here, this one, this guy, originally meant to house biennial-related exhibitions, was transformed in 2007 into the Pavilion of Brazilian Cultures, a democratic space for the cultures of the Brazilian people and their expressions. So what are we to make of this inversion? As Bo Bardi's work in and about Bahia receives increasing attention, this small museum, tucked away under Niemeyer's marquee, contradicts the growing narrative of her legacy. Which one is her architect, the one who designed the ephemeral exhibition, or the one who built a permanent museum in the same space? Bo Bardi briefly included it in her monograph, remembering the past exhibition and adding an enigmatic comment. If I had been the designer of the marquee, I would have requested that it all be demolished. So perhaps in the larger span of time, and despite our stubborn resistance to admit it, not only is all architecture ephemeral, but so are our architects' choices. Perhaps we have to be careful not to monumentalize our heroes too quickly. Perhaps ephemerality is deceiving. A temporary installation might have a long life, while permanent structures lie hidden, as it were, in plain sight. And cunning historians select what they will from the catalog of stories that are presented to us. But if we are to rub history against the grain, as it were, we should take care not only to study the seductive brief moments of resistance, but understand them, rather, within longer contradictory histories. And these are images of Lina Bo Bardi's house in Morumbi, where she lived the rest of her life, and we can see how she collected these folkloric objects of Bahia and kept them in her house. Bo Bardi's negotiation between capital and politics makes her a flawed figure, and that is precisely why we should study her. Heroes are made of cardboard, but flawed figures demonstrate that resistance is possible. It just takes work. Thank you.
Thank you, Ana Maria. I'm going to open it up to questions. Do you have any questions tonight? I do.
There are questions. They're just building up. They need time to work.
Maybe I'll let time pass for a minute by asking a question. First of all, thank you for that. That was really lovely. In terms of how ephemerality works to kind of blur the distinction between, if I'm reading your argument correctly, between display and life, according to Bo Bardi, I'm wondering how we might look at that. We might kind of revisit that idea, which, of course, on the one hand, seems really liberating and fantastic in many ways.
Not for architecture.
Right, not for architecture, because we make permanence. But in terms of the possibilities of having this sort of avant-gardism of an event that's unfolding, that's about the dynamism of the thing itself, of the event and so forth, rather than the permanence of art, which I feel like there's also a danger that when you blur the boundary between the two things, you don't negate the presence of both. And the idea of things that are displayed always somehow brings with it like the capture of those objects. And I think here in the last pictures where she's collecting these objects, she's still kind of capturing a culture in a way. And I wonder if there's a place there to maybe more, to critically assess the idea of blurring. And I think this is something that's ongoing today. Lots of performative, participatory, etc. We can say art, but kind of everything now is participatory. So I wonder if you might comment on that.
Sure. And I think a big clue that pushes against or questions Bo Bardi's intentions are in the photographs of the exhibition itself. None of them show these performances. They're very modern architecture type photographs that she commissioned. So the ones she doesn't commission have the public, but the ones she commissions and publishes in her own are, the architect's obsession, no people in the pictures. So she's still thinking as a modern architect. And I think a lot of the ephemeral qualities so she's negotiating this argument, and a lot of that impulse comes from the playwright, Martim Gonçalves, who is the person who had been collecting these objects and was also the theater director of the school in Bahia and brings in all these performances. The objects themselves, they're very fragile. There's also they're non-lasting. Even the ones in her house, I don't know how they maintain them, but they're made of newspaper and gesso and this sort of thing. So they're meant to dissipate and not last. So in a way, we might say it's sort of useless to collect them, but she used to collect them, right? So I agree, and I'm still struggling with this argument. In the logic of the exhibition, it works because they bring these objects and they insert them. So the objects challenge the idea of this modern developmentalist state of these artists that are producing sort of eternal art, right? So that's the logic that I think works. I think that's why that exhibition, that specific moment works, because it's just a moment. Perhaps that's a good argument to question the Niemeyer Pavilion now, the one that intends to collect Brazilian folk art, right? So maybe that reverts again to Niemeyer.
Again, we have to capture. Yeah, I think these are interesting questions about the limits of and the challenges of using exhibition space and spaces of events as sites to enact resistance. We had earlier in the year Emily Scott coming to talk with us about institutional critique, its own limitations, and new forms, or emerging forms of artwork that intend to kind of push beyond those limitations. So, these are all, I think, questions that a lot of us are kind of grappling with. And as you know today from the discussion, like how do we as architects, operate in this field? How do we resist, but also, have a viable life and work, and not to kind of put ourselves at work.
But I think, so I sort of kidded around, oh, it's not liberating for architects because we build buildings. But I think it is liberating to think of buildings not only as the physical objects, but also as programs in an unintendedly cohesive way. Right? There's a lot of programming and actions that can take over space. And we can be architects by designing and programming those actions.
Anyone else?
You mentioned the president consuming the exhibition at the Biennale, and that begs me to question whether this could be seen as an effective form of resistance, if what it was resisting against was missed in the process.
Yeah, definitely. I think you know they were not going to change Kubitschek's mind, but what I think of is the audience. So I mentioned before, Tony Bennett speaks about architectural exhibitions, and he speaks about the main purpose of exhibitions as forming an audience and informing the audience. First of all, in Bennett's logic, which I partially agree with, you as the audience, you're informed because you are there. You're not being exhibited, right? You are in the place of power, and you are being told how to be a citizen. These are things to be appreciated, right? So I would argue this counter exhibition was aimed to the audience of the biennial, right? It's addressing the audience of the biennial. It's giving them this different option. It's just off to the side, right? And it's making an argument against everything that's contained in that biennial. It's not addressed to the president because so he's oblivious to it. He can digest it. But I wouldn't measure the efficiency through Kubitschek, right? But through the broader audience, which of course we unfortunately do not have visitors' records, right? But I would say that's where, in any case, that's where its effort lies.
Thanks for that. Anyone else?
Did she also use for architecture to express resistance? Because it seems like the architecture she did was one thing, a lot of this thing, or
but did she, or was it just reserved to the exhibition space, which then implies sort of kind of audience?
I argue that this exhibition marked a shift in her career. She was trained as a modern architect, and in the house that I sort of briefly showed, you see it's glass. She had a very Miesian aesthetic, lots of steel, very clean lines. The later works, there's a brutalist component, but what really changes is the program. Because she built a museum, and you can say it's about the content of the exhibition. But the last few the projects she does after this exhibition are very collective projects. The Sesqui Pompeia, they're either museums that are specifically aimed towards popular art, they're community projects, they're community theaters, or it's this neighborhood project that's a series of, she refused the word cultural center, but it's what she does is in this neighborhood, the program, the brief was for a neighborhood sort of community center, and she basically researched all the neighborhood associations. There was a senior citizens dance group, there was a theater group, so she researches all the community groups that are taking place already, and then she says, I'm just going to provide a space for these groups. So there's a programmatic charge to what she does, and this really starts after the exhibition. Before, she was also doing museums, but she was arguing, oh, I'm going to illuminate with European art, I'm going to illuminate these Brazilian masses who have no culture. So there's really a change in her perception of Brazil. It's a little unfair, right? I'm quoting her from when she's just off the boat in Italy. But there's a big shift with her stay in Bahia and her contact and argument with all these discourses that are taking place in that region in her practice and the programming of her practice.
Anyone else?
How much So her sort of changing the program projects, how much of that comes down to? So her sort of changing the program of her projects after this sort of deciding to rebel. How much is that coming from her agency, and how much is that coming from just who she's associating with, who is asking her to do these projects versus how much she can actually control?
Her first projects in Brazil were all sponsored by this big media person, Chateau, right? So in the first project, she's basically responding to him, and several of the other ones, she's still responding, she's funded by him, right? And she will later say, oh, there are good people and people that are not so good, and this is the case of this person, and I had to work with him. So she's still compromising. That's why I like to show that final little museum that's completely against what the exhibition had been about, right? So she's still sometimes making these compromises. She's a problematic figure. But in the programs like this Pompeia, the ones that she's involved with, there are choices where you can see her agency. What are those choices? Some of these projects, she basically evades, Chateau also passes away, but she seeks out groups that are community-based or community-involved. And this one, this Pompeia, this neighborhood center, it looks wonderful. It's still done under the dictatorship, but opens after. It's the last few years of the Brazilian dictatorship. It's a municipal project. And she seeks out this client, which is the City Hall of Sao Paulo. So she gets a commission. She could have still designed something else, a different type. So it's the way in which she, as an architect, decided, I'm going to do this research. I'm going to go into this neighborhood. This is where there's an agency, right? Because you can come as an architect and say, well, I'm going to demolish this whole area. There's actually a factory that was there, so she discovers that this factory is by Enevic, the French inventor of reinforced concrete. So it's like, oh, this is actually architecturally significant. So she cleans out the factory and then does the 2 towers. With the same brief, with the same client, she could have just raised everything and just done something completely different. So you have space to move there.
Anyone else? I have one perhaps last question. I wonder to what degree does this research of yours touch or impact in one way or another your activist practices and the collaborations that you have, specifically because I think what you, or at least some of the stuff you do is with exhibition space.
Yeah, well, first this was a weird coincidence because when I first got into researching this exhibition as protest, I was at the same time planning Detroit Resists. And this is just complete freak coincidence, but I decided, oh, this is perfect. So they both align in a very weird way. And I actually just finished co-writing a piece about Detroit Resist, in which we also quote Tony Bennett and exhibitions. So that's why I put the Venice Pavilion there. So in Detroit Resist, for instance, I'm not acting as an architecture historian, but certainly now that has passed, I am reflecting on it as an architecture historian, which is interesting. But I think we can all wear many different hats, but perhaps having the same convictions.
Any final questions? If not, I think we should all thank Anna Maria Leone.
Thank you so much.